Hi, my name is Jade Hotchkiss. I work for the Sickle Africa Data Coordinating Centre, or SADC, which is based at the University of Cape Town in South Africa. SADC is an initiative of the Sickle in Africa Research Consortium. I am mainly an ontology curator and developer for the Sickle Cell Disease Ontology, or SCDO. Today, I will talk about the first layperson translation of the Sickle Cell Disease Ontology, making SCD-Centred eHealth platforms more accessible. I have been supported in this work by and am honoured to represent my illustrious co-authors, including the SADC project manager, Vicky Nimbavare, our software developer, Wilson Mupfurirwa, and then some names known to many in the scientific community, including Nicole Vasilevsky, Melissa Haendel, Ambrose Wonkum, and Nicola Mulder. To start off with, I will briefly describe sickle cell disease, or SCD. It is a complex multi-system red blood cell disorder, and it is one of the world's most common monogenic pathologies. It involves a genetic mutation that causes the production of abnormal adult hemoglobin, which causes red blood cells, which are typically biconcave discs, to contort into a sickle shape. The cells then die early, leaving a shortage of healthy red blood cells, which decreases oxygen delivery, and the rigid sickled red blood cells then block blood flow in various parts of the body. This causes pain, which is referred to as sickle cell crisis. Because this can affect many parts of the body, SCD has highly variable phenotypic manifestations, including serious, if not life-threatening conditions. So, who does this affect? According to the most recent estimates published this year from data between 2000 and 2021, in 2021, there were 7.74 million cases worldwide, but SCD is most prevalent in sub-Saharan Africa, where 79% of the people with SCD live in under-resourced, low and middle-income countries, as can be seen by the hotspot indicated here. What is staggering to think of is that in sub-Saharan Africa, 50 to 90% of children born with SCD actually die before age 5, and of the survivors, up to 90% die before reaching 18. You might be wondering what can be done about this high burden of disease in sub-Saharan Africa. Currently, the only cure is a bone marrow transplant, which is rarely possible. For almost all SCD patients, increasing survival involves limiting complications and reducing early mortality. To do this, optimal management of SCD is required, and this means access to comprehensive multidisciplinary care with treatments including medication and blood transfusions, requiring lifelong therapy and monitoring. High-income countries such as the US, who have been able to provide such comprehensive care, are evidence of how it is positively impacting survival. So, what is preventing this care in sub-Saharan Africa? Unfortunately, in these countries, healthcare services are typically inadequate, especially for conditions such as sickle cell disease. And thus, SCD patients have suboptimal management of their disease via healthcare services, which means that SCD management becomes mainly the responsibility of patients and their communities. This is problematic as patients and their communities are typically not equipped to self-manage the disease. They really do require support from health professionals in the form of information, education and skills, social facilitation, and equipment. But the health professionals themselves generally lack resources and formal education in managing SCD, and thus they provide inadequate and inconsistent information and advice to SCD patients who seek them out. And so the cycle of providing inadequate healthcare that leads to suboptimal management of SCD is perpetuated, causing more complications and increased mortality. Fortunately, there is evidence of great potential for mobile health or eHealth applications to assist with the management of SCD in low and middle income countries, based on a study done to assess its potential use in India, which is a low income country also with a high burden of SCD. eHealth applications can increase SCD awareness, improve patient monitoring, and improve patient self-management, which can increase drug adherence and health-related quality of life for SCD patients while decreasing hospitalizations and morbidity. Unfortunately, despite the ever-increasing number of eHealth applications available globally, there is a lack of evidence that they are actually effective long-term in developing countries, where not many patients continue to use them successfully due to various structural and cultural barriers. such as having poor or no access to mobile phones or data, not having adequate technological literacy. There can be cultural reasons, and the apps can be maladapted to the local context. This can be in the form of eHealth apps not being provided in the relevant language, or not being at the correct level of technicality for the intended users. We already started addressing the language barrier by producing a French SCDO, and this last point is where our current work fits in. The SCDO is currently the most comprehensive source of standardized terminology in the SCD domain. It is intended for use in standardizing data collection across multiple Sickle in Africa consortium research sites, and it is an oboe foundry ontology and is available in multiple ontology repositories such as Bioportal, OLS, and Ontology. We also have an SCDO website, but I will get to that later. We have plans for developing various SCDO-driven or supported electronic health or eHealth platforms to provide easily accessible and updated SCD-related information and services for SCD researchers, clinicians, and patients, and for facilitating the collection of standardized data for research studies. The SCDO will be used as the backbone for standardizing any data collected via these platforms, enabling sharing of such data for cross-study analyses. You can learn more about the SCDO on the SCDO website. There is an infographic video about it. You can access a list of SCDO publications. You can find links to the various SCDO versions and release notes. You can also use the term search box to search for a specific SCDO term and view a separate page dedicated to that term. For example, here I typed in pain and got a list of the 10 best matching terms. If I click on a term, it opens that term's static page. You can see the English label and definition, and there is more information further down on the page. What's different from the content displayed here compared to the ontology repositories is that there is a button for displaying the French annotations of a term. So if you click this, the term's French label and definition are displayed. These French annotations are from our French SCDO, and they make SCDO terms accessible to more SCD clinicians and researchers. And we have plans to translate the SCDO into other languages, such as Portuguese. Coming back to the SCDO-driven eHealth platforms or integrations we have planned for benefiting patients, these could be in the form of patient-facing eHealth apps or eHealth applications for clinicians, giving them information or resources for providing to SCD patients to support their SCD self-management. The success of these platforms depends on SCDO terminology being more accessible to lay people. And so, we needed an SCDO version that includes layperson labels and definitions for terms. Our first step was to extract English annotations, focusing on labels and definitions for all SCDO terms from the SCDO AL file and to put those into an Excel format, which was then used by ontology curators and genetic counselors to write layperson labels and definitions and add additional synonyms for relevant SCDO terms. Once we had those, we needed to include them in the SCDO AL file, and we were hoping to use an existing method to do this. But the only existing method we found, being the method used by the Human Phenotype Ontology, or HPO, was unfortunately not suitable for the SCDO. We wanted an approach that allowed us to search for and display terms within popular tools, for example, Protégé or Web Protégé, and we found the best way to do this was by leveraging the use of language tags, as we had used for the French SCDO. So we developed our own method that allows for layperson translations of other term annotations, not just labels, and that uses a layperson language tag, ENXLP, from our own language tag protocol, shown here, which we developed for the French SCDO. It indicates that an annotation is an English layperson annotation. The X singleton indicates that the LP subtag following it that we are using to indicate layperson is a private use subtag. The third big step in the method involved adapting our workflow for translating the SCDO into French to create a new workflow for creating a layperson ontology. This involved adapting or writing new Python scripts to help automate the process of including layperson labels, definitions, and new synonyms in the SCDO AL file and managing future updates. using those to apply the layperson language tag to layperson annotations in the SCDO file, and writing standard operating procedures or SOPs for all processes involved. And so we produced the first layperson translation of the SCDO, which has quite decent coverage with layperson labels for 86.3% and layperson definitions for 85.3% of all SCDO terms. This is an example of an SCDO term showing how we use language tags to indicate English and layperson and French annotations. Our other main result is a workflow for producing and maintaining a layperson translation of the SCDO, including 4 Python scripts and 6 accompanying SOPs for performing the various steps. The workflow involves 3 main parts. Part 1 being performed when creating a layperson translation for an ontology for the first time, and Part 2 and 3, shown by the yellow portion, are performed for the first and subsequent updates of layperson annotations, respectively, with a few minor differences with regards to the input files used. The orange block indicates steps in the process that are common for all 3 parts. I will go through part 1 so that you can see what is involved in creating a layperson version for the first time. It starts with the ontology AL file being passed through a program that extracts the annotations of terms and outputs these in a text file. This is then manually reformatted and saved in Excel format, could be a shared Google spreadsheet, which is then sent to the people who will produce the layperson annotations, in our case, ontology curators and genetic counselors. The populated Excel file is then manually reformatted and saved as a text file for input into a program that takes this file and the initial AL file and adds the layperson annotations into the AL file, producing a new AL file that contains the layperson annotations, which are indicated with relevant language tags. The main place for accessing the layperson SCDO and the workflow tools is via our SCDO Ontology GitHub repository. Here you will be able to download the latest layperson SCDO AL file and find the development folder where you can access the workflow SOPs and Python scripts. Alternatively, you can use the QR codes on my poster to go directly to the relevant links. You can also access the release notes for the English layperson SCDO in the README file in GitHub. The layperson annotations for SCDO terms will be used to make SCD terminology more accessible to SCD patients and other lay people, which will help improve self-management of SCD by patients and promote increased quality of life and survival of SCD patients, particularly in low and middle income countries. They will also be used to standardize information provided to SCD patients and clinicians via eHealth platforms, as well as the data collected from patient-facing applications used for research studies. I also want to point out that a subset of our SCDO layperson terms is already being used in the Sickle in Africa Consortium's eHealth application prototype called SCD-CHOMI. The layperson annotations are also potentially useful for knowledge discovery, as they may facilitate the retrieval of information, including experiential knowledge, from layperson sources, such as eHealth applications, but also patient blogs and other web sources. The layperson SCDO, which contains technical and layperson terms with synonyms, could then be used to connect this information to the more technical content produced by the traditional scientific world, which could make it possible to discover alternative non-pharmacologic therapies used by patients, for example, the use of traditional herbal remedies to prevent the sickling of red blood cells, which could be helpful for developing and optimizing treatments based on the mechanisms of action of such alternative therapies. This potential for knowledge discovery greatly increases the potential for growing the repertoire of treatment options for SCD and strengthens the case for producing layperson SCDO versions for relevant SCD patient audiences. The workflow will be useful for future updates of the SCDO layperson translation for when the technical version is updated, and can be reused to include layperson annotations in other bio-ontologies, which could accelerate use of bio-ontologies in platforms that make them more widely accessible. Going forward, we plan to produce layperson versions for other technical translations of the SCDO, such as the French SCDO and future technical translations, such as the planned Portuguese translation, as well as for languages that we won't produce technical versions for example, Swahili. For such layperson versions, we would want to capture provenance information regarding the order of how these translations were produced, and would do that by using more specific translated layperson language tags, which we included in our language tag protocol. For example, we would use the language tag shown here to indicate that the Swahili layperson annotations were translated from English layperson annotations, with the LP1 private use tag indicating that the source was the layperson version of the initial language. And for the French translation, we could use the other tag shown there to indicate that the technical English annotations were first translated to French technical annotations, which were then used to write French layperson annotations. And the LP2 private use tag thus indicates that the source was the technical version of the initial language. We will need to consider what to do about producing layperson versions for relevant languages that have significant differences between dialects. Would we provide different versions using more specific language tags to differentiate between dialects? How would the actual translations be done? Would translators need to be versed in both dialects with us providing annotations in each? Or would we provide layperson annotations for one dialect and then have other translators fluent in the additional dialects review the work of the first and point out where differences are required? There are many aspects to consider. Regardless, we have a lot of work to do in further developing and refining the layperson ontology workflow. Firstly, adapting the workflow for producing layperson versions of other languages, depending on how we decide to go about producing those. This could involve providing technical and layperson annotations to the translators, possibly also auto-translations of English layperson annotations. Another aspect of this is to adapt the ontology translation tool GUI used for the French translation to create a GUI for creating and maintaining layperson ontologies. A limitation of this work is that we have not evaluated the quality of our layperson annotations against any existing dictionaries. It may be worth comparing our layperson annotations with relevant publicly available datasets, such as the Medlane dataset, which contains human annotated and aligned data used for translating professional clinical jargon to layperson understandable language. But this was beyond the scope of the current work. The authors of this work would like to acknowledge the NHLBI who, through the SADC grant, make this work possible, and we would like to thank the Bio-Ontologies COSI for generously providing a travel fellowship so that I could attend this year's ISMB conference. Thank you very much.